Yeah, well, let me tell you a little bit about, I'll just give a brief introduction, but then the main presentation is recorded. So we'll see part of it, hear part of it here, and then part of it in the tabernacle. And I assume if you're Methodist, you know something about the tabernacle. Very occasionally we'll get people who don't know much, but most are Christians who know a lot. Yeah, you're aware, in the main part of the building, there's a bookstore with books on Bible topics, Anabaptists and Mennonites and Lancaster County, many cookbooks, and some souvenirs. So feel free to look around. And as I said, part of the presentation will be here, it's recorded, and then part inside. Well, you know as much about the tabernacle as I do, probably more. This mural was painted by Lancaster Mennonite High School students. Lancaster School is just a stone's throw down the road. And it, of course, shows the tabernacle as the center of the encampment of all the people. And as you know, the tabernacle is where God resided. One of the things that I think about as I listen to this presentation is the theological idea. And if you use big words, God is both transcendent and God is immanent. Meaning that God is so great, above us, far away, that we can't know God and can't approach God. The other side of the paradox is that God is very close to us and cares about each of us. And what I get from the story of the tabernacle is the transcendent sense of God, of being so great, so holy, that in many ways God is present with the people but isolated from them. So think of God, think of the image of God that's projected in the Old Testament. I'll turn on the recording, and there's an introduction to the biblical story, which I'm sure you know, but it's always a good review.
We welcome you on a journey. Let's go back in time more than 3,000 years. We're in the Middle East, and we're joining the people of Israel on their journey with God. This journey appears in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Jews, Christians, and Muslims consider these books to be holy scripture, testimony to God at work in our world. The people of Israel came from the family line of Abraham and Sarah. One of their grandchildren, Jacob, was named Israel during an encounter with a messenger from God. The name Israel came to describe the whole people group. The people of Israel believed that there was only one true God, Yahweh. They understood that Yahweh loved them and was with them. Yahweh desired for them to enjoy good, fulfilled lives. Others who lived nearby worshipped many gods. Their gods seemed far removed and uninterested in their daily lives. We begin the tabernacle journey when the Israelites lived in the land of Egypt. Their homeland had been Canaan. So how did they get to Egypt? Through a series of events, Jacob and Rachel's son Joseph had been enslaved in Egypt. Joseph helped the Egyptians prepare for a time of famine. He oversaw food distribution during the famine. When Joseph's brothers came to buy food, he invited them to move to Egypt so he could help provide for their needs. In response, the entire extended family moved from Canaan to Egypt. It was about 70 people who made this move. Rather than return to Canaan after the famine, this family group continued living in Egypt. The Israelite population expanded quickly. This concerned Egyptian leaders. To control them and to steal the economic benefit from their labor, Egypt forced anyone who was Israelite to work for no pay. Egypt made laws designed to make the daily lives of every Israelite very difficult. The people of Israel cried out to God for justice. They asked God to deliver them from their suffering. Moses was an Israelite who had been adopted into the Pharaoh's family. He grew up privileged in the Pharaoh's household. God used Moses to start the Israelite journey to freedom. One day, Moses witnessed an Egyptian mistreating an enslaved Israelite. Moses responded to this cruelty in a violent way. He killed the Egyptian. Then he immediately fled the country in fear for his own life. He went to the Sinai Peninsula, where the family of his wife Zipporah lived. While hiding there, he took care of his father-in-law's sheep. One day, while shepherding the flock, Moses encountered God on a mountainside. Moses noticed a bush that was burning, but never burned up. As he neared the bush, he heard God's call to return to Egypt and free the Israelites from their suffering. Moses responded to God's call to provide leadership. The Pharaoh refused Moses' demand that the Israelites be freed. A series of 10 devastating plagues convinced him, and the Pharaoh of Egypt allowed the Israelites to leave the country. Quickly, one night, the Israelites gathered everything they had and left Egypt. They began a journey as refugees. They headed for Canaan, their ancestral home. Walking and carrying their possessions, their journey became an extended camping trip. They thanked God for their release from their suffering in Egypt. Moses' sister Miriam, who was a prophet, led the people in singing and dancing with joy. But they soon faced hard times on their journey. The Israelites forgot that feeling of triumph and gratitude, and they began grumbling against Moses and against God. They failed to trust God's ability to provide food, water, and protection. The biblical story suggests that because of this distrust, their journey in the wilderness extended over 40 years. At one point on their journey, they camped at the very mountain in the Sinai where God first spoke to Moses. There, they experienced God's presence. They felt the ground shaking. They saw the mountain covered with smoke and fire. They were afraid. God called Moses to the mountaintop. There, God gave him 2 tablets of stone inscribed with the 10 Commandments. God also gave Moses instructions for building the tabernacle. The word tabernacle in its verb form means to dwell with or to live among. In the noun form, it refers to a structure in which to dwell. At the time, the people were camping and living in tents. The tabernacle was God's tent, placed in the center of the campground. A tall cloud rested over the tabernacle in the daytime. At night, it turned to fire. It was an all-day and night visible sign of God's presence. It also served as a signal for when it was time to break camp and move to a new location. The cloud would shift away from the tabernacle and stay at the edge of the camp. This told the people it was time to pack and prepare to move. The cloud led the people to their next camping place. As the clouds began to move, Israelite family groups followed in a prescribed order. Yahweh God gave Moses specific details of how to build God's dwelling place. In the tabernacle, God chose to dwell with God's people. In our tabernacle replica, we followed the dimensions of the original tabernacle and its courtyard as faithfully as possible. We use 18 inches to equal a biblical cubit. Look through the windows to see a replica of the courtyard area. The tabernacle courtyard measured 75 feet by 150 feet. It was enclosed with a loosely woven white linen curtain fence. 7.5 feet high posts held the curtain in place. At the courtyard's east end, a colorful 30-foot section of the curtain could be pulled aside to offer entrance into the courtyard. Just inside the entrance stood the brazen altar. It was 7.5 feet square and stood 4.5 feet high. A ledge at mid-level surrounded the altar. This ledge provided a place for priests to walk as they placed items on the wood burning on the altar grate. Near the altar stood a bronze basin or laver filled with water. Priests coming on duty washed their hands and feet here before beginning their daily work. A full bath in this water had been a part of each priest's consecration into the priesthood. People brought their tabernacle offerings to the north side of the brazen altar, where the figures of the animals and priests stand in our courtyard. As we think about the meaning and purposes of the offerings, consider this. The tabernacle represented God's presence. Coming from one's tent toward the tabernacle must have inspired an awesome sense of worship. Gifts and offerings brought to the tabernacle were offered in worship to God, and approaching a holy God created a fresh awareness of one's own sinfulness. The system of offerings and sacrifices that began at the tabernacle continued for about 1,000 years. When the Israelites settled more permanently and began farming, they brought a portion of their grain, olive, and grape harvests to the tabernacle as thank offerings or worship offerings. Many of the tabernacle offerings involved animal sacrifice for offerings to God. There were 4 general types. 1, sin offerings in response to breaking God's commands. 2, trespass offerings for wrongs committed within the community. 3, fellowship or peace offerings emphasizing relationships in the community. And 4, burnt offerings of atonement and dedication. These offerings involved sheep, goats, calves, doves, or pigeons being sacrificed and presented to God. Blood from the sacrifices was sprinkled on the altar or poured on the ground beside the altar. A priest removed fat from the animal and burned the fat on the altar. The meat of some offerings remained with the priests for their food. For the fellowship or peace offering, the individual who brought the offering returned home with the meat after the sacrifice and prepared a meal to share with others. This sharing built goodwill and good relationships in the community. In the case of the burnt offering for atonement and dedication to God, the fire on the altar consumed the entire animal carcass. When a person presented a trespass offering, that person also had to make restitution for the wrong they had done to someone else. Note the mural of the tabernacle encampment on the wall. See that the tabernacle was fully enclosed and covered with no windows or openings. Our tabernacle replica is opened up, uncovered, so you can see into it. As you enter the tabernacle, please be seated. Remain seated, and please do not take photos until the presentation ends.